You wake up, you run your hand through your hair, and a clump comes with it. You check the shower drain, and it looks like a small animal moved in overnight. You tell yourself it's stress, or maybe it's the season changing, or maybe you've just been pulling it back too tight lately. Most of the time, that's not actually what's happening. Hair loss is one of those symptoms that almost everyone will experience at some point, and almost everyone misdiagnoses themselves when it does. Because the real causes are rarely the ones people assume, and one of the most overlooked triggers is something people interact with dozens of times a day without a second thought. We're going to get into all of it. But first, let's start with what's actually going on. Subscribe, and let's find out what's actually happening to your hair. The basics. What normal hair loss actually looks like. A healthy scalp loses somewhere between 50 and 100 hairs every day. If you have long hair, that number can look alarming on a brush or in a drain. That is completely normal. Each hair on your head goes through a growth cycle that lasts about 4 years, then enters a short resting phase, then falls out and gets replaced. This process is constantly running in the background, staggered across different follicles so that it all happens gradually and invisibly. The problem starts when something disrupts that cycle. When it does, it doesn't just affect 1 or 2 hairs. It can throw dozens or hundreds of follicles into that resting phase simultaneously. Then, a few months later, they all fall out at once. That's the pattern that most people notice and misread. The hair that falls out in month 3 is responding to something that happened in month 1, which is why the cause is almost always somewhere in your recent past, not in your present. Here's how to figure out where to look. 1. The shock your body remembers. The most common cause of sudden, diffuse hair loss has a clinical name that sounds more serious than it is: telogen effluvium. What it means, simply, is that a significant physical stressor pushed a large number of hair follicles into their resting phase at the same time. 2 to 4 months later, all those hairs fall out together. The stressor could be almost anything: a serious infection, major surgery, childbirth, a crash diet, even a sustained period of very high psychological stress. COVID-19 became one of the most documented triggers of this type of hair loss in recent years, with large numbers of people reporting dramatic shedding 2 to 3 months after their illness. The important thing to understand about telogen effluvium is that the shedding itself is not the problem. The follicles are still healthy. New hairs are already growing underneath. The hair comes back, but it takes time, usually several months. And in that window, it can look genuinely alarming. The simple diagnostic test for this is called the hair pull test. Take about 50 to 60 hairs between your fingers and pull slowly downward. If more than 10% of those hairs come out easily, that's a positive result and a reason to talk to a doctor. 2. When your immune system turns on itself. Alopecia areata is a condition where the immune system misidentifies hair follicles as a threat and attacks them. It typically shows up as smooth, round patches of hair loss on the scalp, sometimes appearing very suddenly over a short period of time. About 1 in 50 people will experience it at some point in their life. The mildest cases respond well to steroid injections directly into the affected areas of the scalp to calm the immune response. More severe cases, where the patches spread rapidly across the entire scalp, require more aggressive treatment. The condition is not permanent in most people, but it is unpredictable. It can resolve and return. Managing it is an ongoing process rather than a one-time fix. What makes alopecia areata particularly disorienting for people experiencing it is that the scalp itself looks completely normal. There's no inflammation, no scarring, no texture change, just smooth skin where hair used to be. That absence of obvious damage is actually part of what distinguishes it from other autoimmune conditions affecting the scalp. 3. When the damage is permanent. Not all immune-related hair loss is as forgiving. Discoid lupus is an autoimmune condition that causes significant inflammation directly in the skin and scalp, and unlike alopecia areata, it destroys the hair follicle itself. Once a follicle is scarred, it cannot grow hair again. This distinction matters because the treatment timeline is completely different. With discoid lupus, the urgency is in stopping the damage before it spreads, not in waiting for the hair to come back. Early intervention with anti-inflammatory treatment is what preserves the follicles that haven't yet been affected. Discoid lupus is different from systemic lupus, which is a more widely known diagnosis that involves internal organs. Discoid lupus typically affects only the skin, but the scarring it leaves behind is one of the reasons that any new, unusual pattern of hair loss, accompanied by inflammation or changes in scalp texture, warrants a prompt medical evaluation rather than a wait-and-see approach. 4. The medication nobody warned you about. Most people know that chemotherapy causes hair loss. What most people don't know is that a surprisingly long list of other medications can too, and that the hair loss often comes months after starting the drug, which makes it easy to miss the connection entirely. Anticoagulants, retinoids like Accutane, lithium, and anti-seizure medications, and some blood pressure drugs have all been documented as causes of drug-induced hair loss. The pattern is similar to telogen effluvium. The medication disrupts the normal hair cycle, follicles enter their resting phase, and then months later, the shedding becomes visible. The good news is that in most cases, this is entirely reversible. When the medication is discontinued or the dose is adjusted, the hair cycle resets and regrowth follows. The difficult part is identifying the connection in the first place, especially if someone's been on multiple medications or if the hair loss began long after the prescription started. If you've started a new medication in the past 6 months and are now noticing unusual shedding, that timeline is worth bringing up with your prescribing doctor. It's one of the more straightforwardly fixable causes on this list. 5. What your blood work is telling you. Several nutrient deficiencies cause hair loss, and 2 of the most common are also among the most frequently missed because the symptoms overlap with so many other conditions. Iron deficiency anemia is a significant cause of diffuse hair thinning, particularly in women with heavy periods. The mechanism involves the body redirecting limited iron stores away from non-essential functions, and hair production is one of the first things to go. The fatigue, shortness of breath, and pallor that accompany iron deficiency often get the most attention, while the hair changes get written off as something separate. They're usually not. Restoring iron levels through dietary changes, oral supplements, or in severe cases, intravenous treatment brings the hair back, along with everything else. Zinc deficiency is less commonly discussed, but follows a similar pattern. It tends to produce hair loss that starts at the back and sides of the scalp and often comes with a visible rash. Zinc is unusual in that deficiency can occur even in people who eat zinc-containing foods, because certain compounds in plant-based foods called phytates block absorption. People eating heavily plant-based diets, pregnant women, and those with chronic gastrointestinal conditions are particularly at risk. The challenge with both of these deficiencies is that they require a blood test to confirm. You can't diagnose them from symptoms alone, because too many other conditions look similar. If you're experiencing ongoing hair loss and haven't had recent blood work, a basic panel checking iron stores, hemoglobin, and zinc is a reasonable starting point. 6. The thyroid connection most people miss. Hypothyroidism, the condition where the thyroid gland doesn't produce enough hormone, is one of the most common endocrine causes of hair loss. The classic presentation is diffuse thinning across the scalp, accompanied by other symptoms: dry skin, unexplained weight gain, persistent fatigue, and a general sense of slowing down. What makes hypothyroidism particularly relevant in the context of hair loss is the relationship it has with zinc. Thyroid hormone is required to absorb zinc from food. When thyroid function is low, zinc absorption drops, which means a person with untreated hypothyroidism can develop zinc deficiency even on an otherwise adequate diet. Both deficiencies independently cause hair loss, and both are present at the same time. This is important because treating only the thyroid condition may not fully resolve the hair loss if zinc levels remain depleted. A complete picture requires looking at both. It's one of those cases where overlapping conditions explain why a person doesn't fully respond to what should have been the correct treatment. 7. The pattern that runs in your family. Male and female pattern hair loss are the most common forms of hair loss overall, affecting roughly 40% of women before the age of 50 and the majority of men over their lifetime. Most are driven by the interaction between genetics and androgens, the hormones that include testosterone. In men, pattern hair loss typically presents as a receding hairline and thinning at the crown. In women, the pattern is different, usually a diffuse widening of the part and thinning across the top of the scalp without the hairline receding. One thing worth knowing about male pattern hair loss in particular, when it begins before the age of 40, there's an estimated association with elevated cardiovascular risk. The hair loss doesn't cause heart disease, but the same hormonal and genetic factors that drive early androgenic alopecia also correlate with factors that affect the heart. It's a signal worth taking seriously, not as a diagnosis, but as a reason to pay attention to the modifiable risk factors you do have control over. Effective treatment options exist for both male and female pattern hair loss, and they're substantially more effective when started early. Waiting until the loss is advanced significantly limits what treatment can accomplish. 8. The cause nobody looks for: your water. This one gets almost no attention in conversations about hair loss, and it probably should get considerably more. The water that comes out of your tap in the United States has a problem. More accurately, it has several problems. About 45% of US tap water is estimated to contain PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals. These are per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, man-made compounds used in everything from non-stick cookware to food packaging to firefighting foam. They don't break down in the environment, they accumulate in the body. They've been linked to thyroid disease, kidney cancer, immune suppression, and hormonal disruption. Now, why does that matter for your hair? Thyroid disruption is a well-documented effect of PFAS exposure. PFAS chemicals interfere with thyroid hormone production and absorption, and as we've already established, hypothyroidism is one of the more significant hormonal causes of hair loss. Immune dysregulation from PFAS exposure is also relevant to conditions like alopecia areata, where immune function is already compromised. There's also evidence that PFAS compounds interfere with hormonal signaling more broadly, which matters when androgenic hair loss is driven by that same hormonal environment. But PFAS aren't the only water quality issue relevant to your scalp. Lead is a neurotoxin present in the water supply of millions of American homes, primarily due to aging lead service lines and pipes in older buildings. Lead exposure affects cellular function throughout the body and has been associated with hair loss through its disruption of the metabolic processes that support follicle health. Hard water, which is water with high mineral content, particularly calcium and magnesium at elevated concentrations, doesn't cause hair loss directly, but it does affect the hair shaft and scalp environment. Research has shown that prolonged exposure to very hard water can increase hair breakage and change the surface texture of the hair in ways that exacerbate thinning that's already occurring from other causes. Then, there's chlorine. Municipal water is treated with chlorine as a disinfectant, which is necessary and appropriate. But chlorine strips the natural oils from the scalp and hair, and prolonged exposure through daily washing and showering in heavy chlorinated water can contribute to scalp dryness, irritation, and a weakened hair shaft over time. None of this means your tap water is causing your hair loss on its own, but it does mean that if you're doing everything else right and still seeing unexplained shedding or thinning, your water is worth considering as a contributing factor. Not the only one, but potentially one of them. The practical response to this is straightforward. At a minimum, look up your local water quality report. The EPA requires community water systems to publish annual consumer confidence reports, and these are publicly available. They will tell you what's in your water and at what levels. If PFAS or lead are present above EPA action levels, a certified reverse osmosis filter is the most reliable way to remove them at the point of use. For chlorine and hard water, a shower filter that targets chlorine specifically is a much lower cost option and can make a noticeable difference in how the scalp and hair feel over time. The more important point is this: water quality affects health in ways that are often slow-moving, cumulative, and easy to attribute to something else. The connection to hair loss isn't usually direct or dramatic. It works through the body systems, through hormones, through immune function, through mineral balance, that are themselves connected to how and whether hair grows. Fixing the water doesn't fix everything, but ignoring it when those other systems are already under pressure doesn't help either. 9. The pulling you don't realize you're doing. Traction alopecia is exactly what it sounds like. Hair loss caused by sustained mechanical tension on the follicle. It's most commonly seen at the hairline and temples in people who regularly wear tight ponytails, braids, weaves, or other styles that pull the hair tight against the scalp over extended periods of time. The early stages are reversible. If the tension is removed, the follicle recovers. But sustained tension over years can lead to permanent scarring of the follicle at the hairline, at which point the options become significantly more limited. There's also a psychological condition called trichotillomania. which is a compulsive urge to pull out one's own hair. Unlike traction alopecia, which is a mechanical outcome, trichotillomania is a mental health condition that typically accompanies anxiety, depression, or obsessive-compulsive symptoms. The hair loss pattern is distinctive when examined closely, showing hairs at varying stages of regrowth in a way that doesn't match any external hairstyling pattern. Treatment for trichotillomania focuses on the underlying psychological drivers, rather than the scalp itself. With appropriate support, full recovery is possible. 10. The infections and exposures you wouldn't think to connect. Syphilis causes hair loss. This is not well known, but it's clinically documented. The secondary stage of syphilis can produce what's called a moth-eaten pattern of hair loss across the scalp, appearing as irregular patches of thinning, rather than smooth bald spots. Because syphilis is known as the great imitator, a condition that can mimic almost any other disease, this symptom often leads patients through a confusing diagnostic process before the actual cause is identified. The good news is that syphilis is curable with penicillin and the hair comes back. Severe allergic reactions to hair dye are another underappreciated cause. The culprit in most cases is a chemical called PPD, which is present in most permanent hair dyes. An allergic reaction significant enough to cause scalp swelling and inflammation can trigger the same kind of follicle shock that sends large numbers of hairs into their resting phase simultaneously. The hair loss appears weeks to months after the reaction, which makes the connection easy to miss. Avoidance of the allergen and treatment of the immune response allows for full recovery in most cases. The bottom line: hair loss is rarely simple. The cause is almost never found on the day shedding starts. It's almost always somewhere in the past, in a stressor the body absorbed, a deficiency that quietly accumulated, a medication that disrupted the cycle, or an environmental factor that was never investigated. The practical path forward looks like this. Track the timeline. When did the shedding start? And what happened 2 to 4 months before that? Was there an illness, a major stressor, a new medication, a dietary change? That window is usually where the answer lives. Get blood work done. At minimum, complete blood count, ferritin and iron studies, thyroid function, including TSH and free T4, and zinc levels. These are basic, widely available tests that'll catch the most common nutritional and hormonal causes. Check your water. Look up your local consumer confidence report. If you're on well water or live in a home built before 1986, consider having your water tested independently. Chlorine sensitivity from showering can be addressed cheaply with a shower filter. PFAS and lead exposure require reverse osmosis treatment if your levels are elevated. Photograph the pattern. The shape and distribution of hair loss is diagnostically useful. A doctor looking at a photograph of the pattern over time can often narrow the differential significantly faster than a verbal description alone. And see a doctor. Not because all these causes are serious, but because the right treatment for each one is completely different from the others. And treating the wrong cause wastes time while the actual one continues. Hair comes back in most cases. The variables are how quickly the cause is identified and how early treatment begins. The most expensive version of this problem is waiting. If this changed the way you think about what's actually behind hair loss, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this. Check your water reports, track your timeline. And if something isn't adding up, get the blood work done before you buy the supplement.